on the other side of the war. So I think now it's time to present the third speaker of this morning. Again, if you want to pose questions, just write them in the Q&A and we will then collect them all. Professor CHANCHAL Kumar Sharma will today give us a presentation on fiscal federalism and diversity accommodation, providing insights from India. He's professor of political science at the Department of Political Science of the Central University of Haryana, and he's associate at the German Institute of Global and Area Studies at Hamburg in Germany from 2006 onward. He has published extensively on fiscal federalism with the special focus on India from a political scientist perspective, but not limited to India, because his works also include studies of comparative nature. I think now it's time to pass the floor to Professor CHANCHAL Kumar Sharma. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Alice. Good morning, good afternoon. First of all, I am grateful to Francisco, Javier, and Alice for associating me with this project and for providing me this wonderful opportunity to present my analysis on secessionism in India, which is still a work in progress. So the caveat here is that my conclusions are subject to considerable fine-tuning in the next rounds of my revisions. To make this presentation self-contained, I would like to start with the reference to the broader literature on this subject before coming to the case of India. When we are trying to understand the role of fiscal constitutions in diversity accommodation, it's important to understand that fiscal federalism or federal finance in multi-level systems holds the key to creating perceptions among ethnic minorities or territorial communities toward fair distribution of wealth or economic justice. Therefore, fiscal constitutions are relevant in understanding mechanisms that forestall, trigger, perpetuate, exacerbate, or terminate demands for secession, insofar as they hold the key to creating perceptions via two key policy instruments, that is fiscal autonomy and fiscal equalization, both of which are seen as policy measures for conflict resolution. However, there is no unanimity amongst scholars regarding the precise role these policies play. For instance, fiscal equalization, which can potentially resolve regional imbalances on the one hand, and pacify subnational grievances through financial compensation on the other, has been found in some studies to be promoting fiscal political instability by making prosperous regions subsidize their less well-off counterparts. In addition, the evidence also indicates that fiscal equalization may encourage inefficiency by softening budget constraints. Likewise, fiscal autonomy, which has been found to reduce the net payoff from secession in some cases, has been shown to actually increase incentives to secede in some other studies. In addition, the evidence also indicates that fiscal autonomy as a policy instrument tends to widen the existing regional inequalities. In fact, there is a dividing line between the traditional public finance literature, which emphasizes the role of intergovernmental transfers, and the public choice literature, which emphasizes fiscal autonomy. Not surprisingly, then the large N literature, which seeks to test these hypotheses, arrives at inconclusive results. It's important to highlight that the literature on territorial accommodation of subnational identities pays scant attention to the interaction between cultural heterogeneity and economically based tensions that precede ethnic strife in many cases. Because of this oversight, the large and empirical literature remains fragmented, with scholars approaching this issue from multiplicity of perspectives. Some scholars link secessionist conflict to economic inequality between identity groups. Others emphasize the role of political exclusion from access to state power. Still, others have found no significant relationship between conflict and inequality, either in terms of political exclusion or economic deprivation of ethnic groups. This highlights the need for substantial comparative case study work that systematically analyze interactions between fiscal constitutions, economic disparities, ethnic divisions, and party politics under different objective conditions and contexts. In this regard, it's also important to underline that the literature on fiscal federalism and federal finance generally neglects the fact that the problem of regional development or regional income disparities overlaps with the nationalities problem in many cases, more so in developing countries such as India. To make sense of what I mean by this, let me state one of the most generalizable findings, which I call the overlap thesis, which states that there is a necessary relationship between the questions of nationality and economic justice. According to this thesis, then, the problems and patterns of ethnic separatism and secession cannot be fully understood without some reference to the question of getting a fair economic deal for ethnic minorities. In the case of India, I have found that while regional disparities in general may simply be an extension of the wider problem of poverty, yet two similarly placed states of comparable income may perceive their relative deprivation differently depending on their nationality status within the country. For instance, financial problems or concerns of similar income states may be similar, but secessionist conflict arises only in those cases where these financial grievances overlap with the nationalities question. A closer look into the empirical data shows that this happens for a reason. I do find a piece of clear evidence, which I will briefly discuss in the course of my presentation, that the national government policies do not seem to be promoting financial self-sufficiency of the minority-dominated regions, especially the secessionist ones among them. But rather, the attempt has been to keep them relatively more dependent on central finances and relatively less developed in comparison to the safer jurisdictions. These conclusions are based on my paired comparison of the economic trajectory of two rich states, one non-secessionist, that is Haryana, and other secessionist, that is Punjab, and two poor states, one secessionist, that is Assam, and other non-secessionist, that is Bihar. I also compared Jammu and Kashmir with Himachal Pradesh, both of which are adjoining states and both are characterized by hilly terrain. In other words, the persistence of regional disparities in countries like India might not simply be an extension of the problem of poverty. In some cases, the national ruling elite may actually be politically unwilling, not just incapable, of promoting regional financial self-sufficiency, and might even be interested in orchestrating the economic dependency of secessionist regions. Indeed, when we look closely at the sequence of events from the origin of grievances to outbreak of secessionist crisis in Punjab, Assam, and Jammu and Kashmir, we find that in all three cases, there was a perception of some sort of cultural domination, a fear created by the actions of the majority community dominating the national institutions and the policies of the central government representing national majority. However, the perception of economic injustice often acts as the first catalyst, which politicize the suspicious or insecure ethnic minorities and propel them to seek institutional means for the expression of their dissent and grievances. The case studies of secessionist movements in India show that it's only when state institutions and political processes fail to offer institutional channels for the expression of discontent that ethnic or religious minorities mobilize to achieve their interest through violent means. This lesson is very clear from cases where conflict has been averted, for instance, in case of Tamils, the cases where it has been managed and even transformed, for instance, in case of Assam and Mizoram, and the cases where the secessionist conflict has remained totally intractable, for instance, the ongoing conflict in Jammu and Kashmir. Therefore, institutional decay is the second catalyst in the overall chemistry of secessionist conflict. So this is the second thesis that emerges from the experience of India. These two theses set the context for further deeper analysis. For instance, the overlap thesis tells us that financial accommodation plays a critical role in diversity accommodation, and the twin catalyst thesis tells us that any fiscal approach to diversity accommodation will work only to the extent there are institutional channels for the expression of discontent. So now, before we discuss India's approach to fiscal accommodation of conflict and its success or failure, it's important to underline that India's dominant strategy against violent secessionism has been military suppression of the conflict. This is because advocacy of secessionism is unconstitutional and illegal in India. The tone for India's strategy for secessionist movements was set quite early in response to the Nagas movement for freedom, which had kicked off before independence in 1929. Although Gandhi was in favor of the Nagas' right to self-determination, Nehru opposed the idea on the grounds that it would set a precedent that could literally dissolve the new Indian state. Indeed, at the time of India's independence, the princely states of Hyderabad and Travancore attempted to secede. On the other hand, the Assamese, the Mizos, and the Tamils were also flirting with the idea of separatism. However, it was the Naga community that declared independence on the 14th of August 1947, a day before India was to declare independence. Thereafter, the Nagaland Church conducted a plebiscite in May 1951, which recorded nearly unanimous vote for independence. And by 1956, an armed revolt started against India. The Indian government quickly reacted with all its military might and ruthlessly crushed the movement using the army, the air force, as well as its paramilitary and local police. Finally, a ceasefire was negotiated in exchange for the formation of a new state within India. With this state of Nagaland, with extensive fiscal, legislative, and judicial autonomy, was established on 1st of December 1963. Therefore, the tone for India's strategy towards secessionist movements was set. The strategy was to combine a very brutal military suppression of secessionist violence with offers of concessions, provided the leaders of the movement keep the exit option off the negotiating table. Finally, the 42nd Amendment Act 1976 added the word integrity to the preamble in order to assert India's opposition to any threat that challenges its territorial integrity. Now, I'll give you a brief overview of India's fiscal constitution, which is important for understanding its role in diversity accommodation. As per the constitutional assignments of revenue-raising powers and spending responsibilities, the central government in India has access to most broad-based, productive, buoyant, and elastic sources of revenues. However, subnational governments have responsibilities to provide most of the economic and social services. This asymmetrical assignment of revenues and expenditures leads to vertical fiscal gap between the center and the states. Furthermore, there are very wide economic disparities or horizontal imbalances among the states. To deal with this situation, the Constitution of India provides for a comprehensive system of intergovernmental transfers. First of all, there is a provision for the appointment of the Finance Commission every 5 years to make recommendations on, number one, tax devolution to states to fill the vertical fiscal gap, and number two, grants in aid to cover the post-devolution deficits of the states. The aim of revenue sharing or unconditional transfers recommended by the Finance Commission is to enable all states to provide comparable levels of public services at comparable tax rates. Until 2015, there was a non-statutory body called Planning Commission, which provided formula-based assistance to states for implementing development plans. After the abolition of the Planning Commission in 2015, there is no separate mechanism to provide financial assistance for the state plan schemes. Therefore, the Finance Commission from the 14th Finance Commission onwards are required to recommend transfers for covering the entire revenue account expenditures of the states. In addition, the central ministries also provide financial assistance for central welfare schemes at the state level. Some of these are fully funded and are called central sector schemes, while others are jointly funded by the center and the states and are called centrally sponsored schemes. These are completely discretionary and seek to ensure equalization of the expenditure levels of the states in respect of specified services. Finally, there are various forms of ad hoc assistance by the center to the states in form of grants and loans. In addition to these explicit sources of transfers, there are a variety of implicit sources of food, fuel, and fertilizer subsidies, subsidization of public sector enterprises in the states, and highly subsidized borrowings of the state governments from the banking sector, the financial institutions, and the central government itself. The analysis of various components of transfers show that the general purpose transfers, which are recommended by the Finance Commission, are most equalizing, whereas the specific purpose transfers or the schematic transfers have a regressive bias, which is not significant. The equalization effect of Finance Commission comes from its formula for horizontal distribution, which incorporates a mix of variables representing revenue and cost disabilities, as it is clear from this slide. Notably, the highest weightage is always given to the income or the fiscal capacity distance. Furthermore, the Finance Commission recommends the highest percentage of total transfers. So therefore, the overall transfer system is quite equalizing with elasticity coefficient of minus 0.267. Overall, the fiscal federal structure in India is very well laid out. However, in terms of outcomes, the fiscal federal institutions seem to have a limited practical impact. For instance, regional disparities have shown increasing trend with the coefficient of variation in per capita incomes increasing consistently over the years. Overall, as this figure shows, the divergence of regional economies is increasing over the years. Quite interestingly, the three secessionist regions of Assam, Punjab, and Jammu and Kashmir are among the slowest growing economies. This is surprising because the low-income states like Assam and Jammu and Kashmir are amongst the highest recipients of tax shares and grants. This shows that even after the central transfers, low-income states with low revenue capacity spend significant lower per capita expenditures on social and economic services. This has implications for the secessionist movements in India, especially amongst the low income and poor states. Because much of the literature on subject indicates that acute regional economic and income disparities can be a source of instability and unrest. In India, if you see, most of the economically based conflicts started in mid-1960s when India's growth rate began to decline and revenue surplus of the center was no longer sufficient to plug fiscal gaps at the subnational level. The conflicts deepened in the late 1970s when deficits appeared in the current accounts of both the center and the state. Center-state conflicts further escalated in 1980s as the Indian economy entered into a phase of crisis. The data suggests that there is a positive correlation between the inability of the center to support states' finances to meet their expenditure obligations and rise of resentment in states against the center. In both the low-income states of Assam and high-income state of Punjab, the initial grievances were decidedly economic. The major grievance in Assam was the immense lack of control of people of Assam over their own land and natural resources. This grievance led to secessionist violence after 1985, intending to establish an independent sovereign state of Assam. They see the symptoms of colonial rule in India's extractive interventions, because it is their perception that India does not give back to the state a fair share of benefits from the resources extracted from their states. In Punjab, which is a high-income state, the major grievance has been that despite Punjab being the breadbasket of the country, it does not get its fair share of the income generated by the state. Moreover, the central government exercises control over Punjab's river waters, agricultural prices, industrial policy, and development policies. Now, someone can argue that these are there economic issues and challenges within the country, but without any secessionist demand. The answer to this puzzle comes in the form of the Overlap Thesis, which says that secessionism emerges only when economic and ethnic divides overlap with their attendant dynamics of interaction and mutual reinforcement. In Kashmir Valley, where the degree of ethnic divide and polarization is high, sentiment against the establishment emerged only because of the economic misgovernance of the state governments who were seen as the puppets of the Indian government. These union-backed state governments indulged in widespread corruption and nepotism and did not allow the policy benefits to trickle down to the intended beneficiaries. Even when this overlap became prominent, the secessionist violence had not emerged until the locals had tried and tested the existing institutional channels to direct their grievances. They even formed a political party and contested elections in 1987, in which they actually received widespread support, but the elections were rigged. This slide shows the statements of two Kashmiris interviewed by the magazine of one of the magazine of India, national magazine called India Today, in aftermath of the rigged elections and the consequent disquiet. Kashmiris in general were shocked to find that the elections were rigged and the leaders they had supported were not only declared defeated, but falsely implicated and imprisoned. These defeated leaders then established two Islamist militant groups to whom Pakistan promptly provided full financial and moral support. So once the genie was out of the bottle, it was captured and controlled by Pakistan. So it would not. Thereafter, it would not be put back in the bottle. Here comes the role of the twin catalyst thesis, which focuses on fatal combination of economic injustice and political disempowerment. This explanation is relevant in understanding the origins and trajectory of secessionism in Kashmir. Now, let us come to the question of suppression and concession to deal with secessionist crisis. As stated earlier, India's dominant strategy against secessionism is to suppress all kind of violence and terrorism by use of brutal military force and extend concessions only on the condition that only on the condition of total allegiance to the Constitution of India. The violent secessionist movement in Assam started in the late 80s and intensified in the year 1990, but it was ruthlessly continued by launching two military operations, the Operation Bajrang in 1990 and Operation Rhino in 1990. In January 1992, when the leaders and the cadres of the militant outfit surrendered, the government of India announced a few concessions such as central assistance for modernization of education in the state, state share in royalties from oil, plywood, and tea, and for the state. Before we look into the data to confirm whether the promise was kept or not, let us have a quick look at the trajectory of conflict in Punjab. The violent secessionist movement in Punjab started in early 80s, and the Indian state responded with all its brutal might, launching a ferocious crackdown on Sikh militants and their sympathizers. In 1985, the central government decided to concede most of the demands of the moderate leaders of the Akali Dal. Therefore, concessions were offered in the form of Punjab Accord, which was signed between Akali leader Longowal and Rajiv Gandhi, the then Prime Minister of India, on 24 July 1985. However, the accord was not acceptable to the extremists and militants who wanted complete independence. Therefore, they assassinated Longowal within 1 month after the accord and initiated a deadly militant movement. As expected, the response was even more brutal state action. The policy was simply to catch and kill. Thousands of innocents were killed during these ruthless operations. But by the end of 1993, terrorism was literally torn out by the roots. The Punjab's Director General of Police, Mr. Gill's hard-hitting and merciless approach totally eradicated the leaders as well as the cadres. The operation was such that all leaders and cadres of the militant Khalistan movement were killed. So the Sikhs lost their bargaining power almost completely. Therefore, no formal institutional accommodation of the Sikh demand took place. Even the Rajiv Longowal Accord, which is still believed to be the key to dispute resolution in Punjab, was never revived again, and the concessions related to increased autonomy, river water sharing, transfer of Chandigarh to Punjab, etc., were not granted. And yet, the movement ended almost permanently. Now, let me show how differently Indian fiscal federal system has responded to three secessionist movements.
Professor Chanchal, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You still have a couple of minutes left. Sorry for this.
Yeah, I'll finish within, I think.
Sorry again.
10 minutes. Yeah. I knew about the time limit. But first, let us have a look at the structure of their finances in one graph. As this graph illustrates, Punjab raises more than 70% of revenues from its own resources, whereas Assam and Jammu and Kashmir raise 25 to 30% from their own revenues. This reflects Punjab's high income status and also shows a high level of revenue mobilization by Punjab in comparison to other two states. With regard to financial assistance to these states, I find that Assam's share in transfers increased rapidly after the conflict in the state ended, indicating a rise in financial rewards or appeasement to satisfy the economic demands of the secessionists. Punjab, however, has not been fortunate. The reason is that the central government had no incentive to offer concessions. Why? Because number one, the movement was thoroughly crushed, and number two, it had no external support to maintain or revive insurgency. To be sure, Pakistan did support the movement for a few years, but then decided to focus more on Kashmir, where it had higher stakes. Therefore, the alleged economic discrimination against Punjab continues and has even worsened after the war against militants was won by the state decisively. The approach here has, in this case of Punjab, seems to be of financial retribution rather than reward. What lends support to this financial retribution thesis in case of Punjab is the fact that the break appears at around 1992-93 when militancy was successfully eradicated. Additionally, when we compare Punjab with the neighboring state of Haryana, both of which came into existence in 1965 after partition of former state of East Punjab, we find support for the allegation of the leaders of Punjab movement there that there had been an attempt to keep the state industrially backward. This is clear from the data where we observe whether we observe industrial production or capital outlay. Let us now observe some statistics for Kashmir. Kashmir is a curious case of a genie that escaped the bottle in 1989 due to one major blunder of the central and state governments of the time, that is massive rigging of the state election in 1987. Since then, there have been many attempts to coax and cajole the genie back in bottle, but the crisis remains intractable. Let us see how the data looks like. First of all, financial bounty to the state appears enormous by all standards and comparison. The graphs do show that financial assistance did increase after secessionist crisis broke out. However, in terms of economic outcomes, the data paints a bleak picture. This case is full of contradictions. For instance, although Assam receives high financial support from the center, just like Assam does, yet the debt GDP ratio of Kashmir is as high as that of Punjab. This indicates that in case of Jammu and Kashmir, the outlays are similar to and even more than the case of Assam, whereas outcomes are similar to and even worse than Punjab. In other words, outlays are not translating into outcomes. For instance, if we compare Jammu and Kashmir with the neighboring state of Himachal Pradesh, which like Jammu and Kashmir has hilly and difficult terrain, it is surprising to note that the gap between Jammu and Kashmir and Himachal Pradesh in terms of the number of factory units has expanded immensely since the outbreak of conflict. Similarly, the share of industrial production in Jammu and Kashmir and STP, net state domestic product, is declining, although it was much higher than Himachal Pradesh before the secessionist crisis began. Overall, let me conclude the major findings by saying that lack of fiscal equalization does create anxiety, fear, and insecurity in the low-income states, whereas the excess of fiscal equalization has a similar demoralizing effect on the high-income states. This finding is subject to the presence of the ethnic economic overlap and the perception of deprivation and disempowerment among the ethnic minorities. I have encapsulated these two preconditions for the rise of violent secessionism in the form of the overlap thesis and twin catalyst thesis, respectively. It also emerges from my research that the center has the room to maneuver via concessions only until military confrontation escalates. Once military suppression starts, it tends to boost the very forces that it seeks to suppress. And secessionist crisis enters a vicious cycle of reinforcement. However, in certain situations, the use of brutal force can actually weaken secessionist forces. This situation arises when militants lose support from their own community and receive negligible support from the external powers. Under these conditions, the national army and police get a winning and militancy is suppressed. However, this situation, it seems, reduces incentives for the center to offer concessions, which are typically offered only in the exchange for giving up the armed movement and demands for secession. So these are my findings so far. Thank you so much, and thanks for the patience.
Thank you so much, Professor Chanchal Kumar Sharma, for this very interesting presentation that really gives the idea of how diversity is somehow the rule in India instead of the exception. So I will leave comments for
so we can collect your question on India at the same time.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Francisco. So my question on India, first one is a clarification, because I've understood well that secessionist state after or during the secessionist claim or the secession movements, they do receive an increase in transfer, or have understood it wrong? And eventually, do they again decrease? But my question was related to something different anyhow, because as far as I've understood, states do not have a role in the decision-making process related to the equalization mechanism. So with the exception of the Finance Commission, it's the union government that have the dominance in this field. But I wonder if other issues or other informal instruments are in place to influence the decision. I'm thinking about, for instance, political party affiliation. So states which have the same political party affiliation as the union government do effectively get a higher share. Or I'm thinking about swing state that could eventually attract more revenue, and thinking about the revenue that are shared without any formula, but also about the instruction that are given by the union government. Are they affected or by this political affiliation, or this has nothing to do with that? Thank you so much.
That's all. First of all, the broader and the general conclusions regarding central state transfers, fiscal transfers to the states in India, they do not apply to secessionist states because they are dealt with in a different manner, and depending on, there are case by case kind of decisions. And the approach of the union government has not been uniform across the secessionist states. As far as the partisan federalism thesis is concerned, that the own party ruled governments get more financial assistance, that is true if we aggregate the entire data. But again, in case of the secessionist states, for instance, in case of Assam, which is a low-income state, and Jammu Kashmir is also low-income state. Now, in both these cases, we see that when the secessionist movement began, the government did actually increase the financial appeasement, or you can say financial assistance, the magnitude of financial assistance for however, at the same time, some of the political concessions were unacceptable in case of Jammu and Kashmir, which is seen as more antagonistic in comparison to Assam. In Assam, the secessionists were ultimately co-religionists. They belonged to the same religion, although they had different language, they had different culture, but they are Hindus, the Ahoms. But in Jammu and Kashmir, the problem is also sort of communal. And Pakistan's intervention is also there. And in case of Punjab, because as I told, they had lost their bargaining power because the militancy also lost support among the common people. And no militancy can survive without the support of the indigenous people. And also because there was no external support. So therefore, no institutional accommodation is seen in the case of Punjab. So you see, case-by-case decisions are made in case of all the secessionist regions in India. Anything I have left unclarified in this?
You're muted, Alice.
I had lost the screen because I was writing in the chat to Professor Dave Bell. Yeah. No, I could follow everything. I could just find the unmute microphone, sorry. So thank you very much, Chanchal, for your reply. And I have to add something because Professor David Bell wrote to me saying hello to everybody and excusing that he had to go because we are a bit late, and for his, again, sorry, but he wanted to say goodbye to everyone, but he just wrote to me. And so, okay, and would like to thank you for this fruitful workshop and discussion. And to Chanchal, thank you so much for your answer.
Yeah, I think we can close this webinar that has been rather long, unfortunately, especially for those in the Far East that I believe it's quite late now in Australia. So I would like to thank you all for being here with us today and for your wonderful and very insightful presentations. We will keep in touch with you, of course, for the book chapter. And I would also like to remind you of this Federal Scholar in Residence program that my colleague Petra Mafertaina posted in chat, a program which allows you to win a 3 weeks research stay here in Bolzano in South Tyrol in northern Italy. You just need to hand in a paper that can be written in up to 5 languages, if I'm not mistaken. So thank you very much from my side, also from Alice for being here with us today. We will upload these webinars to our YouTube channel, so you could check them out offline if you cannot attend all of them, and we will continue tomorrow with our final panel featuring the cases of Canada and Spain. It will be at 5 p.m. Central European Eastern Time, and so with this we will close. And again, thank you very much to the 3 of you, also to Professor Bell, who had to go, for sharing your insights on this very fascinating topic. Thank you and have a good day.
You too.
Thank you. Bye. Have a pleasant day.
You too. Thank you. Have a